She never imagined that asking a stranger to dance would put a gun to her brother's head, or that the man everyone called a monster would become the only person willing to die for her. But the most shocking truth, the billionaire in the wheelchair had destroyed her family years before she ever laid eyes on him. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let me take you back to the night that changed everything. Chicago's Harrington Hotel blazed like a golden palace against the November sky. Inside the grand ballroom, crystal chandeliers cast diamonds of light across marble floors. The city's wealthiest moved like elegant sharks in tailored suits and silk gowns, their laughter sharp as champagne bubbles. This wasn't just any party. This was the annual Mercer Foundation Gala, where fortunes were flaunted and deals sealed with handshakes worth millions. Everyone who mattered was here: politicians, oil executives, tech moguls, the kind of people who decided fates over cocktails. But in the farthest corner of the opulent room, away from the swirling dancers and clinking glasses, sat a man nobody dared approach. Julian Mercer, 42 years old. Net worth, $8 billion. Current status, completely invisible. His wheelchair gleamed silver under the lights, but the man himself radiated a coldness that made even the boldest socialites turn away. 5 years ago, Julian had been Chicago's golden boy, the youngest billionaire to ever dominate Wall Street, a man who could topple governments with a phone call. Now he was the cautionary tale parents whispered to ambitious children. They said he hadn't walked in 5 years. They said his own board of directors wanted him gone. Some claimed his accident wasn't really an accident at all, that someone close had finally made him pay for his sins. Tonight, the whispers were especially vicious. "Look at him," hissed Victoria Ashford, wife of a city councilman, "just sitting there like some broken king." "I heard his own family won't even visit him anymore," added another woman, her diamond earrings catching the light as she shook her head. "Karma, if you ask me." Julian's steel-blue eyes swept across the dance floor, his expression unreadable behind his perfectly groomed salt-and-pepper beard. He'd learned to read lips years ago, a skill that came in handy when people thought you couldn't hear their poison. But he wasn't here for their approval. He was here because absence would show weakness, and Julian Mercer, wheelchair or not, would never be weak. The jazz band struck up a slow waltz. Couples glided across the floor in perfect synchronization, a world Julian could watch but never join, until she walked in, not through the main entrance where photographers waited. Not in designer silk or glittering jewelry. She slipped through the service doors in a crisp black and white waitress uniform, a silver tray balanced in her hands. Danielle Brooks, 22 years old, college dropout, working her third job this week to keep the lights on at home. She moved differently than everyone else in the room. No pretense, no performance, just quiet determination as she weaved between the champagne-drunk elite, invisible in the way only service workers could be. But Julian saw her immediately. Maybe it was how she held her shoulders straight, despite the exhaustion in her dark eyes. Maybe it was the way she smiled, genuinely smiled, at an elderly man who thanked her for his drink. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something he couldn't name but felt in his chest for the first time in years. Their eyes met across the crowded ballroom, and in that moment, neither of them knew they were staring at their salvation and their destruction. Subscribe now, because what happens next will shatter everything you think you know about love, revenge, and the price of redemption. Comment below where you're watching from and rate this story 1-10. Trust me, you'll want to be here for what's coming. The evening wore on. Danielle refilled glasses and cleared plates, her movements efficient and practiced. But she kept glancing toward that corner where the lonely billionaire sat like a king without a kingdom. Everyone else saw his wheelchair. Danielle saw something different. She saw a man trapped behind a wall of whispers, just as she was trapped behind her server's uniform, both of them invisible in plain sight. An exhausted, reckless thought sparked in her mind. What did she have to lose? With a boldness that surprised even her, she made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Setting her tray on a nearby table, Danielle walked across that polished marble floor, her heart hammering against her ribs. The conversations around her began to fade as heads turned. By the time she reached Julian Mercer, the entire ballroom had gone silent. She looked down at the most feared man in Chicago and asked the question that would set everything in motion. "Would you like to dance?" The words hung in the air like a challenge to fate itself. For 3 heartbeats, Julian Mercer said nothing. His piercing blue eyes studied Danielle's face, searching for the cruel joke, the hidden camera, the bet that surely motivated this moment. In 5 years, no one, not family, not friends, not even paid companions, had asked him to dance. "You know I can't," he said finally, his voice low and rough like distant thunder. But Danielle didn't flinch, didn't apologize, didn't back away like everyone else did when faced with his reality. Instead, she smiled, not with pity, not with condescension, with something Julian had forgotten existed, genuine warmth. "Then I'll dance for both of us." Without waiting for permission, she took his hand. The ballroom erupted in gasps. Victoria Ashford's champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble. The jazz band faltered for half a note before continuing, as if afraid to stop and break whatever spell was unfolding. Danielle began to sway gently to the music, her movements graceful despite the stairs boring into her back. Her fingers intertwined with Julian's, and for the first time in years he didn't pull away from human touch. "She's lost her mind," someone whispered. "Poor thing doesn't know who he really is," hissed another voice. "This is humiliating, someone should stop this." But Julian wasn't listening to them anymore. He was watching Danielle's face as she moved to the rhythm, her eyes closed in concentration, completely unbothered by the spectacle they were creating. When was the last time someone had touched him without being paid to? When was the last time someone had seen him as more than a cautionary tale or a business opportunity? Slowly, almost involuntarily, Julian's grip on her hand tightened. And then something miraculous happened, something that would haunt the gossip columns for weeks and change the course of 2 lives forever. Julian Mercer smiled, not the cold, calculated smile he used in boardrooms, not the practiced expression he wore for photographers. This was different, vulnerable, real. It lasted only seconds, but Danielle caught it. Their eyes met, and she saw past the wheelchair, past the rumors, past the fortress he'd built around his heart. She saw the man he used to be, and maybe, just maybe, the man he could become again. The song ended. Reality crashed back like cold water. Danielle released his hand and stepped back, suddenly aware of the 300 pairs of eyes watching her every move. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment, but she held her head high. "Thank you," she whispered. Julian's expression shifted back to stone, but his voice carried something softer than usual. "Thank you." As Danielle turned to retrieve her tray, Julian caught her wrist gently. "What's your name?" "Danielle Brooks." "Julian Mercer." "I know who you are." Their eyes held for one more moment before she disappeared back into the crowd, leaving Julian alone with a feeling he hadn't experienced in half a decade. Hope. But across the ballroom, hidden in the shadows near the bar, someone else had been watching, someone who did not appreciate what they'd just witnessed. Richard Mercer, Julian's younger cousin and heir apparent, crushed his whiskey glass between his fingers, blood mixed with expensive liquor as he stared at the spot where Danielle had vanished. This was a complication he couldn't allow. 7 days passed like a fever dream. Danielle tried to forget the billionaire in the wheelchair, tried to lose herself in the rhythm of her 3 jobs. Morning shifts at Murphy's Diner, afternoon cleaning at the medical center, evening classes at community college. But every quiet moment brought back the memory of Julian's smile and the way his hand had felt in hers. She was wiping down tables at Murphy's when the sleek black Bentley pulled up outside. Most people would have walked away. Most people would have ignored what came next. But if you're still watching, you're not most people. Subscribe now, because this story is about to take a turn that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about fate. The driver stepped out, a mountain of a man in an expensive suit who clearly wasn't from this neighborhood. Detroit's South Side didn't see many cars worth more than most people's houses. Danielle's hands stilled on the coffee-stained table as the driver approached the diner's glass door. Through the smudged window, she watched him scan the nearly empty restaurant before his eyes settled on her. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This couldn't be about the dance. 7 days was too long. Rich people forgot about the help within hours, not days. The bell above the door chimed as he entered. Every head in the diner turned. Mrs. Patterson with her crossword puzzle, Tommy with his morning hangover coffee, even Cookie, the owner, emerged from the kitchen to stare. "Miss Danielle Brooks?" The driver's voice was professionally neutral, but his eyes were kind. "Yes?" The word came out as barely a whisper. "I have something for you." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a cream-colored envelope. Expensive paper. The kind that probably cost more than Danielle made in a week. Her name was written across the front in sharp, precise handwriting that somehow looked both elegant and dangerous. "Have a good day, miss." The driver tipped his hat and left as quietly as he'd arrived. Danielle stood frozen, the envelope burning like fire in her trembling hands. Around her, the diner buzzed with whispered speculation. "Open it, honey," Cookie called from behind the counter. "Don't leave us hanging." With shaking fingers, Danielle tore open the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper and something else, something that made her knees go weak. The note was brief. "Danielle, you reminded me I'm still alive. I'd like to return the favor. Dinner, Friday, 7 p.m. The driver will collect you at 6:30. JMPS. Your brother Marcus has exceptional court vision. Georgetown would be lucky to have him, but it wasn't the note that stole her breath. It was what fell out when she unfolded the paper. A check, made out to Marcus Brooks Basketball Fund, for $50,000. Danielle's vision blurred. Marcus had been dreaming of Georgetown since middle school, but they both knew it was impossible. Even with his talent, even with the partial scholarship offers, they couldn't afford the gap. Their mother's medical bills had eaten through every penny they'd saved. This check would change everything. Marcus could go to college, he could escape Detroit, he could become everything he was meant to be. But it came from Julian Mercer, the man the entire city whispered about in fearful tones, the man whose very presence had made Chicago's elite recoil in horror. What did he want in return? Friday arrived faster than she'd expected. At exactly 6:30 p.m., the black Bentley appeared outside her crumbling apartment building like a dream or a nightmare. Danielle had spent her last $20 on a simple black dress from a thrift store. It wasn't designer, but it was clean and modest. She'd borrowed makeup from her neighbor Rosa and watched 3 YouTube tutorials on how to do her hair. As the car glided through Chicago's streets, Danielle pressed her face to the tinted window and watched the city transform. The broken streetlights and boarded windows of her neighborhood gave way to tree-lined avenues and glowing storefronts. She expected the Bentley to stop at one of those restaurants she'd seen in movies, crystal chandeliers, waiters in bow ties, menus without prices. Instead, they pulled up outside a small Italian place with checkered tablecloths and the warm glow of family photos on the walls. Mama Rosa's. The kind of place where 3 generations worked side by side and the pasta sauce recipe was a closely guarded secret. Julian was already waiting at a corner table, his wheelchair positioned to face the door. He wore a simple navy sweater that made his blue eyes even more striking, and when he saw her, that almost smile ghosted across his lips again. "You came," he said as she approached. "You paid my brother's college fund, of course I came. Sit, please." As Danielle settled into the worn wooden chair across from him, she realized something that made her pulse quicken. Julian Mercer looked nervous. The man who had once controlled billions, who had made presidents wait for his phone calls, was fidgeting with his water glass like a teenager on his first date. "Why here?" she asked, gesturing to the modest surroundings. Julian's eyes grew distant. "Because it's real. No performance, no pretense. Just honest food made by honest people." He paused. "I thought you might appreciate that." For the first time since receiving his invitation, Danielle relaxed. Maybe this wouldn't be what she feared. Maybe Julian Mercer was just a lonely man who wanted company for dinner. But as the evening wore on, as they shared stories over plates of homemade pasta and cheap Chianti, Danielle began to realize she'd been terribly, dangerously wrong. Julian wasn't just lonely. Julian was running for his life. Running for your life? Danielle's fork froze halfway to her mouth. What do you mean? Julian's jaw tightened as he glanced toward the restaurant's front window. Even here, surrounded by the warm chatter of families and the comforting smell of garlic bread, he couldn't fully relax. The accident that put me in this chair, he said quietly, leaning forward so only she could hear. It wasn't an accident. Danielle set down her fork. The pasta suddenly tasted like cardboard. Someone tried to kill you. Someone succeeded in half killing me, which honestly might be worse. Julian's laugh held no humor. A brake line doesn't just snap on a car that's serviced every month, especially not on a mountain road at midnight. The wine in Danielle's glass trembled as her hand shook. Who would? That's the million-dollar question. Could be my board of directors who think I'm too unstable to lead. Could be business rivals who want my companies. Could be someone I destroyed on my way to the top. His blue eyes met hers. I've made a lot of enemies, Danielle, more than I can count. But you must have suspects. Julian was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the rim of his wineglass. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made Danielle's chest tighten. The hardest part isn't knowing who wants me dead. It's not knowing who I can trust. When you have $8 billion, everyone around you has a motive. Even family? Something dark flickered across Julian's face. Especially family. Their waiter, a cheerful man in his 60s who called everyone sweetheart, refilled their wine glasses and disappeared again. The normalcy of the gesture felt surreal against the backdrop of their conversation. "Why are you telling me this?" Danielle asked. "Why trust me?" Julian studied her face in the candlelight. "Because you're the first person in 5 years who looked at me and didn't see dollar signs. You saw—" He struggled for the words. "You saw me." Heat crept up Danielle's neck. There was something magnetic about Julian when he dropped his guard, something that made her forget about the whispers and the wheelchair and the dangerous world he lived in. "You're not what I expected," she admitted. "What did you expect?" "A monster. That's what everyone says you are." Julian's smile was sharp as broken glass. "They're not entirely wrong. I've done things, Danielle. Made choices that destroyed lives. The man I was before this chair, and he wasn't someone you'd want to know. But you're not him anymore. Aren't I?" Julian's eyes searched hers. "What if I told you that 3 days before my accident, I orchestrated a corporate takeover that put 12,000 people out of work? What if I told you I've never lost a single night's sleep over it?" Danielle's breath caught. She thought about her own family, about the factory closures that had devastated Detroit, about friends whose parents had lost everything when companies like Julian's decided their profits mattered more than people's lives. "Did you?" she whispered. "Yes." The word hung between them like a blade. Danielle should have stood up, should have walked out, should have torn up that $50,000 check and never looked back. Instead, she asked, "Do you regret it?" Julian was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible over the restaurant's gentle buzz. "I regret that it took losing my legs to learn how to be human." They finished dinner in contemplative silence, the weight of Julian's confessions settling between them like a third presence at the table. As they waited for the driver, Julian reached across the table and covered Danielle's hand with his. "I want to offer you a job." Danielle blinked. "A job?" "Personal assistant. The pay is generous, and I need someone I can trust." "You barely know me." "I know enough." His thumb traced across her knuckles, sending unexpected warmth up her arm. "I know you're brave enough to dance with the devil. I know you're loyal. You're working 3 jobs to support your family. And I know you're the only person in Chicago who isn't afraid of me. Maybe I should be." Julian's grip on her hand tightened. Maybe you should, but I'm hoping you won't be. The job offer was tempting, more money than she'd ever dreamed of, a chance to escape the endless cycle of diner shifts and night classes. But accepting meant stepping into Julian's world of corporate warfare and assassination attempts. I need time to think, she said. Of course. But Danielle. Julian's eyes held hers as the Bentley pulled up outside. Whatever you decide, be careful. If someone is watching me closely enough to tamper with my car, they might notice who I'm spending time with. A chill ran down Danielle's spine as the full implications hit her. By dancing with Julian, by accepting his dinner invitation, she might have already painted a target on her back. As the Bentley glided through Chicago's glittering streets toward her modest neighborhood, Danielle stared out at the city lights and wondered if she was falling for a man who might get her killed. 2 weeks later, Danielle Brooks walked into the gleaming lobby of Mercer Industries, wearing her first tailored business suit and carrying a leather briefcase that cost more than her monthly rent. She'd said yes to the job. How could she not? The salary Julian offered would pay off her mother's medical debts, cover Marcus's college expenses, and still leave enough for her to finish her own degree. It was a lifeline she couldn't refuse, even if it came with potentially deadly strings attached. Miss Brooks, a woman in her 40s with platinum hair and a shark smile, extended a perfectly manicured hand. I'm Catherine Walsh, head of HR. Welcome to the family. Family. The word felt loaded coming from someone whose smile never reached her eyes. Julian's office occupied the entire top floor, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of Lake Michigan. But it was Julian himself who dominated the space, positioned behind a massive oak desk, reviewing contracts with the focused intensity of a general planning a battle. Good. You're here. He barely looked up as she entered. We have a problem. Gone was the vulnerable man from the restaurant. This was Julian Mercer, the billionaire, all sharp edges and calculated moves. The transformation was so complete it made Danielle question whether the dinner had been real or just another corporate manipulation. What kind of problem? She asked, settling into the chair across from his desk. The quarterly board meeting is tomorrow. They're calling for a vote of no confidence. Julian's fingers drummed against the desk surface. If they succeed, I'm out. Someone else takes control of everything I built. Can they do that? Julian's laugh was bitter. They can try. The question is whether I still have enough allies to stop them. Over the next 8 hours, Danielle got a crash course in corporate warfare. She sat in on conference calls where millions of dollars hung on single words, watched Julian manipulate stock prices with carefully timed phone calls, and learned that business at this level was indistinguishable from warfare. But it was the family dinner that showed her just how dangerous Julian's world really was. The Mercer estate sat on 40 acres of manicured grounds north of the city, a testament to old money and older grudges. The dining room could have seated 20, but tonight only 5 people gathered around the antique mahogany table. Julian, his elderly mother Eleanor, his sister Victoria, his cousin Richard, and Danielle. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. So this is the famous Waitress, Eleanor Mercer said, her voice carrying the particular brand of cruelty that only the very wealthy could perfect. How quaint. Mother, Julian warned. Oh, don't scold me, darling. I'm simply curious about your new assistant. Eleanor's pale eyes raked over Danielle like she was evaluating livestock. Tell me, dear, what exactly are your qualifications for working so closely with my son? Danielle felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice steady. I have experience in customer service, bookkeeping, and how fascinating. Eleanor's smile was arctic. And here I thought your primary qualification was pity. That's enough. Julian's voice cut through the dining room like a blade. But Richard leaned forward, his boyish face wearing a concerned expression that didn't reach his eyes. Julian, we're all worried about you. Making impulsive decisions, trusting strangers. Perhaps the stress of the company is affecting your judgment. My judgment is fine. Is it? Because hiring an unqualified girl from the streets doesn't exactly inspire confidence in your leadership abilities. Danielle watched the family dynamics play out with growing unease. Every comment was calculated, every seemingly innocent question designed to undermine Julian's authority. This wasn't dinner. It was psychological warfare. After dessert, Richard cornered Danielle in the mansion's marble foyer while Julian spoke privately with his mother. "Walk with me," Richard said, his tone friendly, but his eyes cold as winter. "I'd like to show you the gardens." It wasn't really a request. Outside, under the glow of security floodlights, Richard's mask finally slipped. "You think he's some romantic hero, don't you?" Richard's voice carried a venom that made Danielle step backward. "The tragic billionaire who just needs the love of a good woman to be saved?" "I think that's none of your business." Richard laughed, the sound sharp and humorless in the evening air. "It becomes my business when he brings a stray into our home. He doesn't tell you everything, does he? That accident, it wasn't some mysterious enemy." He stepped closer, invading her space. "It was justice, from people he destroyed." Danielle's heart hammered. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the lives he ruins, systematically, deliberately." Richard's eyes were cold as winter. "And he enjoys it." "You're lying." "Am I? Tell me, has he mentioned the Brookhaven Industries acquisition, the one that happened right before his accident?" Danielle's blood turned to ice. Brookhaven Industries. Her father had worked there, had died there when the stress of unemployment triggered his heart attack. Richard saw the recognition in her eyes and smiled like a wolf scenting blood. "Now you're starting to understand. Julian Mercer isn't the victim in this story, Danielle. He's the villain. And if you stay close to him, you'll go down with him." As Richard walked back toward the house, leaving her alone in the dark garden, Danielle realized with crystal clarity that she was no longer just working for Julian. She was trapped in a web where everyone had secrets, everyone had motives, and the man she was beginning to care about might be the monster who destroyed her family. For 3 days after the dinner from hell, Danielle threw herself into work with mechanical precision. She organized Julian's schedule, fielded his calls, and maintained perfect professional distance. But every time their eyes met across the office, she felt the weight of Richard's revelation crushing down on her. Brookhaven Industries. Her father's company. Julian's acquisition. She needed to know the truth, but she was terrified of what she might find. Thursday afternoon, as autumn rain streaked Julian's office windows, Danielle's phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Emergency at the hospital, can you come?" Her blood turned to ice. "I need to leave," she told Julian, already grabbing her coat. "What's wrong?" "My mother," her voice cracked. "Hospital." Julian's expression shifted instantly from businessman to something softer. "Take the car. Vincent will drive you." "I can take the bus." "Take the car." His tone brooked no argument. Northwestern Memorial Hospital's cardiac wing smelled like antiseptic and fear. Danielle found her mother, Rosa Brooks, propped up in bed looking smaller and more fragile than ever. "Mija," Rosa whispered, reaching for her daughter's hand. "They say my heart. It's getting worse." Dr. Patricia Kim pulled Danielle into the hallway, her expression grave. "Your mother needs surgery. Soon. Without it—" She didn't finish the sentence. "How much?" The words felt like glass in Danielle's throat. 200,000 minimum, and that's if everything goes perfectly. Danielle's knees nearly buckled. Even with her new salary, even with Julian's generosity, that kind of money might as well be $1 trillion. "We'll work out a payment plan," Dr. Kim said gently, "but Danielle, time isn't on our side here." That night, Danielle sat in her tiny apartment kitchen, staring at medical bills spread across the table like a death sentence. Marcus found her there at 2 a.m., her head in her hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "Hey." Her 17-year-old brother sat beside her, his basketball practice jersey still damp with sweat. "Mom's gonna be okay." "No, she's not." The words came out harsh, raw. "We can't afford the surgery, Marcus. Even working for Julian, even with everything we've saved, it's not enough." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, His voice carried a maturity that broke Danielle's heart. Maybe we should ask him. Julian. He likes you, Danny. Anyone can see that. I can't ask him for more money. I won't be... She couldn't finish the sentence. Wouldn't be what? His charity case? His debt-bound servant? The girl who owed him everything? Pride doesn't pay for heart surgery, Marcus said quietly. Friday morning, Danielle arrived at the office to find Julian studying financial reports with unusual intensity. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept well either. "How's your mother?" he asked without looking up. "She needs surgery." The words came out flat, emotionless. "Expensive surgery." Julian's hands stilled on the papers. "How expensive?" "It doesn't matter. I'll figure something out." "Danielle." His voice was gentle in a way that made her chest ache. "How much?" she told him. Watched his expression carefully for any sign of calculation, any hint that he was adding this to some mental ledger of what she would owe him. Instead, Julian simply nodded and picked up his phone. "Vincent, I need you to handle something immediately." "Julian, no." Danielle stood up so fast her chair rolled backward. "I'm not asking you to..." "You didn't ask. I'm offering. I can't take more money from you. I already owe you." "You don't owe me anything." Julian's voice carried a finality that silenced her protests. "Vincent, contact Northwestern Memorial. Rosa Brooks, cardiac surgery. I want it handled today." After he hung up, silence stretched between them like a bridge neither wanted to cross. "Why?" Danielle whispered. Julian's eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw past all his defenses to something vulnerable and achingly honest. "Because losing someone you love when you have the power to save them, it's a particular kind of hell, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone." "Julian..." She started to say something. Thank you, maybe, or ask about the pain she'd heard in his voice. But his phone rang, shattering the moment. As Julian took the call, switching back into corporate mode, Danielle realized something that terrified her more than Richard's accusations or her family's financial struggles. She was falling in love with Julian Mercer, not his money, not his power, not his tragic story. She was falling for the man who paid for her mother's surgery without being asked, who looked at her like she was worth more than all his billions combined, who carried his own grief like a stone in his chest. But loving Julian came with a price she was only beginning to understand, because men like him didn't just have enemies, they created them. And the closer she got to his heart, the bigger the target on her back became. That evening, as The board meeting was a massacre. Danielle watched from the back of the conference room as 12 of Chicago's most powerful executives systematically dismantled Julian's empire. Their words were clinical, precise, delivered with the cold efficiency of surgeons removing a cancer. Quarterly profits down 18%, shareholder confidence at an all-time low, erratic decision-making patterns following the incident. Julian sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, his wheelchair positioned like a throne, his expression carved from granite. But Danielle could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his knuckles whitened as he gripped the armrests. Richard sat 3 seats down, wearing a perfectly tailored suit and the satisfied expression of a man watching his plans come together. When he caught Danielle's eye, his smile was razor-sharp. "The motion passes," announced board chairman William Hartley, his voice echoing in the suddenly silent room. "Julian Mercer is hereby removed as Chief Executive Officer of Mercer Industries, effective immediately." The words hit like physical blows. Danielle watched Julian's empire crumble in real time, saw 5 decades of Mercer family legacy stripped away with a simple vote. But Julian didn't flinch, didn't rage, didn't show even a flicker of the devastation that had to be tearing through him. Instead, he smiled. "Gentlemen," Julian's voice carried across the room with deadly calm. "I hope you're prepared for what comes next." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. As the board members filed out, shaking hands and patting each other on the back like they'd just saved the company instead of staging a coup, Richard approached Julian's wheelchair. "Nothing personal, cousin," Richard said, loud enough for Danielle to hear. "Just business." Julian's blue eyes never left Richard's face. Of course, just like father's heart attack was just business. Just like the factory closures were just business. Something flickered across Richard's expression, surprise maybe or fear, but he recovered quickly. "You're becoming paranoid, Julian. It's sad, really." After everyone left, Danielle found Julian alone in his office, staring out at Lake Michigan as storm clouds gathered on the horizon. The silence stretched between them like a wound. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Julian didn't turn around. "Don't be. I knew this was coming. Richard's been planning this coup for 2 years. Richard did this? Richard orchestrated it. Convinced the board I was unfit to lead. Fed them carefully selected financial reports that made my decisions look reckless." Julian's voice was eerily calm. "He's been very thorough." Danielle moved closer, her heart aching at the rigid set of Julian's shoulders. "What will you do now?" "Now." Julian finally turned to face her, and what she saw in his eyes made her breath catch. Not defeat, not despair. Something far more dangerous. "Now I remind them why they used to fear me. Something's coming that will change everything. The man they thought they'd destroyed is about to show them what a real monster looks like. Subscribe now. You won't want to miss his revenge." But as the afternoon wore on, watching Julian make call after call with military precision, Danielle began to see cracks in his armor. The way he rubbed his temples when he thought she wasn't looking. The slight tremor in his hands as he reviewed legal documents. The hollow laugh that escaped when his lawyer delivered more bad news. By 7 p.m., the office was empty, except for them. Chicago's skyline glittered beyond the windows, but the view felt different now, like looking at someone else's kingdom. "Go home, Danielle," Julian said without looking up from his computer screen. "There's nothing more you can do tonight. I'm not leaving you here alone. I'm fine." But he wasn't fine. Danielle could see it in every line of his body, could hear it in the careful way he modulated his voice. Julian Mercer was breaking apart piece by piece and trying desperately not to let anyone witness his destruction. "Julian." She moved around his desk, kneeling beside his wheelchair so they were eye level. "Talk to me." For a moment his mask slipped. Just for a second, she saw the scared, exhausted man beneath the billionaire facade. "They took everything," he whispered. 50 years of my family's work. Gone." "You'll rebuild." Julian's laugh was bitter. "With what?" Richard made sure the vote was unanimous. "No one will invest in a company I'm involved with. No bank will loan me money. I'm finished. You still have your personal assets, tied up in legal battles that will drag on for years." Richard thought of everything. Julian's voice cracked slightly. "He's won." Danielle reached out, covering his hands with hers. "Then we'll find another way." "We?" Julian looked at her with something like wonder. "Danielle, you don't understand. I can't pay you anymore. I can barely afford to keep this office lease. You should find another job before—" "I don't care about the money." Julian stared at her, searching her face for deception, for the angle he was certain existed. Everyone had an angle. Everyone wanted something. But Danielle's dark eyes held only honesty and something that made his chest tighten with unfamiliar warmth. "Why?" he asked. "Why stay with a man who's lost everything?" The question hung between them, loaded with weight neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Danielle felt her pulse quicken as she realized they'd crossed some invisible line. This wasn't about business anymore, wasn't about employer and employee. This was about two broken people who'd found something worth fighting for in each other. "Because you're not nothing without your company," she said softly. "You're Julian, and Julian is enough." Something shifted in his expression. The careful control he'd maintained all day finally cracked, and for the first time since she'd known him, Julian Mercer looked vulnerable, completely, utterly human. Danielle. Her name came out rough, uncertain. She leaned closer, her hands still covering his, and for a heartbeat the world narrowed to just the two of them in that empty office, with the storm gathering outside. Then Julian's computer chimed with an incoming email, shattering the moment like glass. Julian turned toward the screen, his face going pale as he read. No. No, no, no. What is it? Julian's voice was barely audible. Richard's moving faster than I thought. He's calling in all my personal loans, seizing my assets, the house, the cars, the art collection. His hands shook as he scrolled through the legal documents. He's not just taking the company, he's taking everything. Danielle watched the man she'd grown to care about face complete annihilation. But instead of despair, she felt something else rising in her chest. Rage. Richard Mercer had underestimated something crucial in his perfect plan. He'd assumed that destroying Julian would leave him isolated, defeated, alone. He hadn't counted on the waitress who'd learned to fight for everything she'd ever had. Then we fight back, Danielle said, her voice carrying a steel that surprised them both. Julian looked at her with something like hope. How? Danielle smiled, and for the first time in her life she understood what it meant to be truly dangerous. By being smarter than they think we are. Outside, lightning split the Chicago sky, and the storm finally broke. 3 weeks into their war against Richard, Danielle had learned to navigate Julian's penthouse like a general's war room. Legal documents covered every surface, laptops hummed with research, empty coffee cups marked the passage of sleepless nights spent plotting their comeback. Julian had transformed too. Gone was the defeated man from the office. In his place sat a brilliant strategist who dissected Richard's every move with surgical precision. But the intensity was taking its toll. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his hands shook slightly from too much caffeine and too little sleep. "We need leverage," Julian muttered, scrolling through financial records on his tablet. "Something Richard doesn't know we have." Danielle organized another stack of contracts, her movements automatic after days of the same routine. She'd become Julian's partner in every sense, researcher, strategist, the steady presence that kept him anchored when rage threatened to consume his judgment. But she was also hunting for something else, something Julian didn't know she was looking for, the truth about Brookhaven Industries. "I'm going to make more coffee," she announced, needing a break from the claustrophobic atmosphere of schemes and revenge. Julian barely looked up. "Third pot today. You'll give yourself a heart attack." The irony of those words hit her like a physical blow. Heart attack, like her father had suffered when his world collapsed. In Julian's home office, Danielle moved with practiced efficiency, filing documents and organizing the chaos of their investigation. But when she opened the bottom drawer of his antique desk to store a folder, her fingers brushed against something unexpected. A hidden panel, barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. Her heart hammered as she glanced toward the living room, where Julian's voice carried on a heated phone call with his lawyer. Carefully, she pressed the concealed mechanism. The panel slid open, revealing a small compartment containing a single manila folder. The tab read, "Brookhaven Industries, Acquisition Files Confidential." Danielle's hands trembled as she lifted the folder. This was it. The truth Richard had taunted her with. The answer to questions that had haunted her since her father's death. She opened the file. The first document was a corporate analysis, cold and clinical in its assessment of Brookhaven's redundant workforce and outdated operational costs. Her father's name appeared on a list of employees marked for immediate termination to maximize efficiency. But it was the second document that destroyed her. A handwritten memo in Julian's sharp script. Board recommendation. Proceed with immediate closure. Worker compensation packages are not cost-effective. Brookhaven's location makes it perfect for pharmaceutical manufacturing conversion. Estimate 30% profit increase within 6 months of acquisition completion. Potential resistance from union leadership. Suggest legal pressure to discourage lawsuits. Medical benefits termination will expedite workforce dispersal. JM. The folder slipped from Danielle's numb fingers, papers scattering across the hardwood floor like evidence of a crime scene. Julian hadn't just approved the factory closure, he'd orchestrated every cruel detail, the terminated benefits that left her father unable to afford his heart medication, the legal maneuvers that crushed the workers' union, the calculated decision that treating employees like human beings wasn't cost-effective. Her father's face flashed through her memory, the man who'd worked 30 years at that factory, who'd believed loyalty meant something, who'd died clutching his chest in their tiny kitchen while medical bills buried them in debt. Julian had killed him, as surely as if he'd put a gun to Thomas Brooks's head and pulled the trigger. "Danielle?" Julian's voice carried from the living room. "Everything all right?" She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could barely force words past the crushing weight in her chest. "Fine," she called back, her voice somehow steady despite the earthquake inside her. "Just organizing." Moving like a sleepwalker, she gathered the scattered documents and placed them back in the hidden compartment. But she kept one piece, the memo with Julian's handwriting, the proof of his guilt. When she returned to the living room, Julian was studying a legal brief, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up when she approached, and the gentle smile that crossed his face felt like a blade between her ribs. "Any progress with the filing?" Danielle stared at him. This man she'd grown to love, this man who'd paid for her mother's surgery, this man who'd held her when she cried about her father's death, and realized she was looking at her family's destroyer. "I found something," she heard herself say. Julian's attention sharpened. What kind of something? For a heartbeat, she almost told him, almost pulled out the memo and demanded answers, explanations, anything that might make the betrayal hurt less. Instead, she said, "I think I know how to get Richard's financial records." The lie came easily, surprisingly so. But then again, she'd been living with a lie for weeks. The lie that Julian was different, that he'd changed, that love could redeem someone who'd built his fortune on other people's graves. Julian's face lit up with the first genuine happiness she'd seen since the board meeting. How? As Danielle spun a false story about hacking opportunities and insider contacts, she watched Julian's excitement grow. He leaned forward, hanging on her every word, trusting her completely. The man who'd never trusted anyone was trusting her, and she was planning his destruction. "This could work," Julian said when she finished. "If we can prove Richard's been embezzling, we'll destroy him." Danielle's voice carried a coldness that made Julian pause. "Danielle, you seem different." She forced a smile. "Just tired. This has been consuming." Julian reached for her hand, his touch gentle and warm. "I know this isn't what you signed up for. Fighting wars, living like fugitives. After we win, things will be different, I promise." His thumb traced across her knuckles, and she remembered the first time he'd held her hand. How safe it had made her feel. How right. Now, his touch felt like betrayal. "Julian," she said carefully, "when you were building your empire, did you ever think about the people who got hurt?" Something flickered across his expression. Surprise, maybe, or wariness. "Why do you ask?" Sometimes I wonder if the cost was worth it." Julian was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes studying her face with new intensity. "The man I was then," he said finally, "he believed that business was war, that casualties were inevitable, that the strong survived and the weak didn't. And now? Now I know that some victories aren't worth winning, that some costs are too high to pay." His grip on her hand tightened. "You taught me that, Danielle. You showed me there was another way to be strong." The words should have been comforting, should have proven that people could change, that redemption was possible. Instead, they felt like salt in an open wound, because Julian's redemption had come too late for Thomas Brooks. Too late for 12,000 families who'd lost everything. Too late for a 22-year-old girl who'd fallen in love with her father's killer. "I should go," Danielle said, standing abruptly. "I have an early morning." Julian looked confused by her sudden distance. Of course, but Danielle, thank you for staying, for fighting beside me. I couldn't do this without you. As she walked toward the door, Julian's voice stopped her. I love you. The words hit like a physical blow. 3 words she'd dreamed of hearing. 3 words that meant everything and nothing simultaneously. She turned back, memorizing his face, the sharp cheekbones, the silver-touched hair, the eyes that had learned to be gentle because of her. I love you too, she whispered. And she did. God help her, she still did. That's what made her decision so much harder, and so much more necessary. Danielle didn't sleep that night. She sat in her tiny apartment kitchen, staring at Julian's memo until the words burned themselves into her memory. By dawn, she'd made her choice. At 8 a.m., she walked into Julian's penthouse for the last time. He was in the kitchen, making breakfast with the domestic ease that had charmed her weeks ago. Now it felt like watching a performance. The reformed billionaire playing house with his unknowing victim's daughter. Good morning, he said, smiling over his shoulder as he flipped eggs. I was thinking we could review the Morrison contracts after... I know what you did. Julian's hand stilled on the spatula. What? Danielle placed the memo on the granite counter between them, her movements precise despite the tremor in her hands. Julian's face went white as he recognized his own handwriting. Danielle, I can explain... Explain what? How you murdered my father? It wasn't murder. Wasn't it? The words exploded out of her, months of buried grief and rage finally breaking free. You took away his job, his benefits, his will to live. You calculated exactly how much human suffering you could cause for maximum profit. Julian abandoned the breakfast, moving his wheelchair closer with urgent desperation. Danielle, please. That was before I knew you, before I knew him. If I had realized, you would have what? Made an exception. Been slightly less evil because it was convenient. Her voice cracked with the weight of betrayal. My father worked 30 years at that factory. 30 years. He believed loyalty mattered. He died believing the world was fair. I was a different man then. No, you weren't. The words came out as a scream. You were exactly the same man. You just found a pretty new face to make you feel better about all the blood on your hands. Julian flinched like she'd slapped him. That's not true. Isn't it? You think paying for my mother's surgery erases what you did? You think love can resurrect the dead? Tears streamed down her face, but her voice grew deadly calm. Tell me something, Julian. When you were signing that memo, when you were deciding that human lives weren't cost-effective, did you even think about the families you were destroying? Did you care that some of them had daughters who worshipped their fathers? Julian's composure cracked. Stop. Did you wonder what would happen to the children when their parents couldn't afford medicine anymore? When the stress of watching everything they'd built crumble gave them heart attacks in their own kitchens? Stop. Julian's voice broke on the word, but Danielle couldn't stop. Wouldn't stop. 5 years of buried agony poured out like poison from a lanced wound. He died calling my name. Did you know that? My mother told me. In his final moments, Thomas Brooks called for his daughter because he knew he was leaving us with nothing. And you know what's really sick? Julian sat frozen in his wheelchair, his face a mask of devastation. Part of me still loves you. Part of me still wants to believe you've changed. But love doesn't bring back the dead, Julian. And it doesn't make monsters into men. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. When Julian finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. What do you want me to do? I want you to feel what my father felt. I want you to lose everything that matters and know it's never coming back. She turned toward the door, each step feeling like walking through quicksand. Danielle, wait. Julian's plea stopped her at the threshold. If you leave now, I'll have nothing. She looked back one final time at the man who'd taught her heart to hope and her soul to break. Now you know how it feels. The door closed behind her with the finality of a coffin lid. In the aftermath of her departure, Julian sat alone in his too-quiet penthouse, surrounded by the debris of their war plans and the smoking ruins of the only love he'd ever known. For the first time in his adult life, Julian Mercer understood the true cost of his empire. And finally, horribly, he began to pay it. 3 days. 3 days since Danielle had walked out, taking Julian's heart and his will to fight with her. 3 days of sitting in his penthouse like a mausoleum, staring at legal documents that felt meaningless without her steady presence beside him. Richard had moved quickly to consolidate power, seizing assets with surgical precision. The phones had stopped ringing. The lawyers had started hedging their bets. Even Vincent, his loyal driver, was fielding job offers from other wealthy families. Julian had lost before, lost deals, lost money, even lost respect. But he'd never lost the one thing that mattered most. He'd never lost love. His phone buzzed with another message from his lawyer. More bad news, no doubt. More evidence that Richard's victory was complete. Instead, it was a text from an unknown number. Your girlfriend's little brother looks just like her. Same eyes, same smile. Be a shame if something happened to that pretty face. Julian's blood turned to ice. A second text followed immediately. Basketball practice ends at 4 p.m. Roosevelt High School. Accidents happen in parking lots. The timestamp showed 3:47 p.m. Julian's hands shook as he dialed Danielle's number. Straight to voicemail. He tried again. Nothing. Vincent appeared in record time, the Bentley's engine already running as Julian transferred from his wheelchair to the passenger seat with frantic urgency. Roosevelt High School, Julian barked. Fast as you can. The drive took 12 minutes. 12 minutes of Julian calling every number he had for Danielle, leaving increasingly desperate voicemails, his mind painting nightmare scenarios of what Richard might do to an innocent 17-year-old to hurt him. They arrived as basketball practice was ending. Julian scanned the parking lot through tinted windows, searching for threats among the normal chaos of teenagers and parents. There, Marcus Brooks, tall and lanky in his practice jersey, walking toward the bus stop with his gym bag slung over one shoulder, alone, vulnerable. And 50 yards behind him, a black SUV with tinted windows crawled forward like a predator stalking prey. Vincent, get me closer. As the Bentley approached, Julian saw the SUV's passenger window slide down. The afternoon sun glinted off something metallic inside. Not a gun. Worse, a steel pipe. They're going to make it look like an accident. A hit and run that destroys an innocent kid to punish his sister. Subscribe now. You need to see how far monsters will go when love threatens their power. Julian threw open his car door, his wheelchair abandoned in his desperation. Marcus, get down! The warning came too late. The SUV accelerated, engine roaring, as it jumped the curb onto the sidewalk where Marcus walked. Time slowed to a crawl. Marcus turned at Julian's shout, confusion clear on his young face. The SUV bore down on him like a black metal meteor, close enough that Julian could see the driver's face through the windshield. Not Richard, one of his hired thugs, expression cold as stone. Marcus tried to dive aside, his athlete's reflexes kicking in. But the SUV clipped him anyway, sending his body spinning through the air like a rag doll. The sound of impact, bone against metal, the dull thud of a human body hitting asphalt, would haunt Julian's dreams for the rest of his life. Marcus lay motionless on the sidewalk, blood pooling beneath his head. The SUV sped away, disappearing into traffic as if nothing had happened, as if they hadn't just tried to murder a child. Julian dragged himself from his car, his useless legs a dead weight behind him. He clawed his way across the parking lot, the sharp bite of asphalt tearing at the fabric of his expensive trousers and scraping his palms raw. The only sounds he could hear over the ringing in his ears were his own ragged breaths and the screams of teenagers as sirens wailed in the distance. Marcus. Julian reached the boy, his hands hovering over the still form, afraid to touch him, afraid to make things worse. Marcus, can you hear me? Blood ran from a gash on the teenager's forehead, but his chest rose and fell in steady rhythm. Alive. Hurt, but alive. Marcus's eyes fluttered open, unfocused but aware. Who are you? His voice was weak, confused. I'm Julian. Julian Mercer. Your sister works for me. Recognition sparked in Marcus's pain-glazed eyes. The wheelchair guy, from the stories. Yeah, the wheelchair guy. Julian's voice cracked with relief. You're going to be okay, help is coming. Paramedics arrived in a blur of activity, checking vitals, immobilizing Marcus's neck, loading him onto a stretcher with professional efficiency. Through it all, Julian stayed close, his presence both comfort and torment. This was his fault. Richard had targeted Marcus because of him, because of Danielle's connection to him. An innocent kid had paid the price for Julian's sins. At the hospital, Julian waited in the emergency room like a penitent in church. He'd called Danielle 17 times, left messages with increasing desperation, but she wasn't answering. Finally, Rosa Brooks arrived, Danielle's mother, looking older and frailer than Julian remembered from their brief introduction months ago. She moved with the careful precision of someone managing chronic pain, but her eyes blazed with the fierce protectiveness of a mother whose child had been hurt. "Where is he?" she demanded. "Surgery," Julian replied. "Broken ribs, concussion, internal bleeding, but the doctors say he'll recover." Rosa studied Julian's face, noting the tear tracks, the exhaustion, the guilt written in every line of his features. "You know who did this?" It wasn't a question. Julian nodded. "My cousin. He's trying to hurt me through your family." "And why would hurting my family hurt you?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications Julian wasn't sure he was ready to face. "Because I love your daughter," he said simply, "and she hates me for very good reasons." Rosa was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the wisdom of someone who'd survived too much loss to waste time on small grievances. "The man who destroyed Thomas's factory," she said finally. Julian's throat tightened. "Yes." "The man who saved my life with heart surgery." "Yes." Rosa studied him with dark eyes that reminded him painfully of Danielle's. "Complex man, Julian Mercer." Before Julian could respond, running footsteps echoed down the hospital corridor. Danielle appeared around the corner, still in her work uniform, her face a mask of terror. She saw Julian first, and for a moment, fury and relief warred in her expression. Then she saw her mother, and everything else disappeared. "How is he?" "Alive," Rosa said simply. "Thanks to him." Danielle's eyes snapped back to Julian, confusion replacing anger. "I tried to call you," Julian said. "Richard's people. They sent me a threat. I got there as fast as I could." The full implications hit Danielle like a physical blow. Marcus hadn't been randomly targeted. This was about her, about Julian, about the war she'd walked away from. "This is my fault," she whispered. "No." Julian's voice was firm despite his exhaustion. "It's mine, all of it. Your father, your mother's illness, Marcus getting hurt. It all traces back to me." "Julian." "I'm going to end this," Julian continued, his voice gaining strength. "Richard wants to play with innocent lives, fine, but he's not going to hide behind boardroom politics anymore." Something in his tone made Danielle step closer, recognizing the dangerous man she'd glimpsed beneath his reformed exterior. "What are you going to do?" Julian's smile was sharp as broken glass, and for a moment, Danielle saw exactly who he'd been before the wheelchair, before the redemption, before love had softened his edges. "I'm going to remind Chicago why they used to fear the name Mercer." The war began at midnight. Julian sat in his penthouse, surrounded by laptops and secure phones, orchestrating his revenge with the precision of a military campaign. But this wasn't the corporate battlefield he'd once dominated. This was personal, visceral, the kind of warfare that left no survivors. Vincent had become more than a driver. He was now Julian's field commander, coordinating with private investigators, former FBI agents, and financial forensics experts who owed Julian favors from his empire-building days. "Richard's been sloppy," Vincent reported, spreading photographs across Julian's dining table. "Offshore accounts in the Caymans, shell companies in Delaware. He's been embezzling from Mercer Industries for 3 years." Julian studied the evidence with cold satisfaction. "How much?" 47 million. Maybe more once we dig deeper." But money wasn't enough. Richard had tried to kill Marcus, an innocent 17-year-old whose only crime was sharing DNA with the woman Julian loved. That demanded a different kind of justice. What about the SUV? Traced to a rental company downtown, paid for with cash, but we have security footage. Vincent slid a photograph across the table. Thomas Kellerman, ex-military, works security for several wealthy families when he's not breaking legs for hire. Julian memorized the face, rough features, dead eyes, the kind of man who hurt people for money and slept soundly afterward. Where is he now? Safe house on the south side, but Julian, Vincent's voice carried a warning. If you're thinking what I think you're thinking, there's no going back from this. Corporate warfare is one thing. What you're planning is something else entirely. Julian's fingers drummed against his wheelchair's armrest, a tell that Vincent had learned to recognize over the years. It meant Julian was calculating risks, weighing consequences, deciding how far he was willing to go. The answer came in the form of his phone buzzing with a text message, another unknown number. The boy was lucky this time. Next time we won't miss. Attached was a photo taken through a hospital window. Marcus asleep in his bed, bandages wrapped around his head, vulnerable and unaware of the camera watching him. Julian's decision crystallized like ice in his veins. Get me everything, he told Vincent. Richard's financial records, his phone logs, his security details, schedules, everything. And Kellerman? Julian's smile was arctic. Him too. While Julian planned his offensive, Danielle sat vigil beside Marcus's hospital bed, torn between relief that her brother was alive and terror about what came next. The attack had shattered any illusion that walking away from Julian meant safety for her family. Rosa dozed in the uncomfortable visitor's chair, exhausted from days of worry. But Danielle couldn't sleep. Every shadow in the hallway might hide another threat. Every unfamiliar sound might signal another attempt on Marcus's life. Her phone buzzed with a message from Julian. I'm ending this tonight. Keep Marcus safe. I love you. Before she could respond, another message followed. Whatever happens, remember that everything I do now is to protect your family, even if it destroys me. Danielle's hands shook as she typed back, Julian, don't do anything you can't take back. But the message showed as undelivered. Julian had already gone dark. At 2 a.m., Richard Mercer's Lincoln Park mansion looked like a fortress. High walls, security cameras, guards patrolling the grounds with military precision. But fortresses could be breached if you knew the right pressure points. Julian sat in the passenger seat of Vincent's modified van, watching the estate through night vision binoculars. He'd traded his wheelchair for a tactical vest and earpiece, looking more like a special forces operative than a billionaire philanthropist. Security change shift in 10 minutes, Vincent reported from his position overlooking the mansion's rear entrance. You'll have a 3-minute window. Julian checked his equipment one final time. Recording devices, encrypted tablets, and something else Vincent had provided without being asked. A .38 revolver, small enough to conceal, but powerful enough to end conversations permanently. He'd told himself he wouldn't use it, but having it felt like insurance against his own mercy. The security guards changed shifts with clockwork precision. Julian moved through the shadows with surprising agility, his upper body strength compensating for his paralyzed legs. Years of physical therapy had taught him to navigate obstacles that would stop other wheelchair users. Richard's home office occupied the mansion's second floor, a shrine to stolen power decorated with awards and photographs chronicling his rise through Mercer Industries. Julian picked the lock with skills learned during a misspent youth, before billions and boardrooms had refined his methods of breaking and entering. The computer password was embarrassingly simple. King Richard 2024. Arrogance had always been Richard's weakness. As Julian downloaded files and copied encrypted communications, he found evidence of crimes that went far beyond embezzlement. Richard had been planning Julian's destruction for years, bribing board members, manipulating stock prices, even hiring private investigators to dig up dirt on potential allies. But the most damaging discovery was a recorded phone call from the night before Marcus's attack. Richard's voice, cold and clinical. I don't care how you do it. Just make sure the message is clear. Hurt Julian Mercer's people, and I'll hurt his. Kellerman's reply. What about collateral damage? There is no collateral damage. There are only acceptable losses. Julian's hands clenched into fists as he listened to his cousin casually ordering violence against a teenager. This wasn't business anymore. This was sociopathy wrapped in expensive suits and family connections. Finding anything interesting? Julian spun toward the voice, his hand instinctively reaching for the concealed revolver. Richard stood in the office doorway, flanked by 2 security guards. He looked calm, almost amused, like he'd been expecting this intrusion. "Hello, cousin. Still playing with computers, I see." Julian's finger found the gun's grip, but didn't draw it. Not yet. "Richard, you know, I have to admire your dedication. Breaking into my home, risking arrest, all for what? A few financial records that prove I'm smarter than you." "I have everything," Julian said quietly. "The embezzlement, the bribes, the order to hurt Marcus." Richard's smile was razor-sharp. "Do you? That's unfortunate." He nodded to his guards, who stepped forward with weapons drawn. "Because I was hoping we could resolve this family dispute more amicably." Julian calculated distances, exits, chances of survival. The numbers weren't encouraging. "You tried to kill a 17-year-old boy. I sent a message. There's a difference." "Not to me." Richard's expression hardened. "Then maybe it's time this family had new leadership." The guards raised their weapons, and in that moment, as Julian stared death in the face, he realized something that changed everything. He wasn't afraid of dying anymore. The only thing that mattered was ensuring Richard couldn't hurt Danielle's family again. His hand closed around the revolver's grip. Outside, lightning split the Chicago sky as the storm everyone had seen coming finally arrived. The standoff lasted exactly 4 heartbeats. On the 5th, Vincent's voice crackled through Julian's earpiece. "FBI, DEA, and Chicago PD are 30 seconds out. Time to go." Richard's face went white. "What did you do?" Julian smiled as sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer by the second. "I reminded them why they used to fear the name Mercer, but more importantly, I reminded them why they should arrest Richard Mercer. The downloaded files hadn't just contained evidence of embezzlement and attempted murder. They'd revealed Richard's connections to money laundering operations, drug trafficking through his shipping companies, and financial networks that stretched from Chicago to the Cayman Islands." Julian had spent 3 days building an airtight case, then hand-delivered it to federal prosecutors who'd been hunting these criminal networks for years. "You bastard!" Richard snarled, but his guards were already backing toward the exits as police sirens surrounded the mansion. "Consider it a hostile takeover," Julian said. "Family style. When everything you thought you knew gets turned upside down, you need to be here to see how it ends. Subscribe now, because this final confrontation will leave you speechless." The next few hours blurred together like frames from an action movie. Federal agents storming the mansion, Richard in handcuffs, screaming about lawyers and constitutional rights, Julian providing testimony that would put his cousin away for decades. By dawn, it was over. Richard's empire crumbled as quickly as he'd built it, his stolen assets frozen, his co-conspirators arrested in coordinated raids across 3 states. Julian sat in his penthouse as the sun rose over Lake Michigan, feeling emptier than he'd expected. Revenge was supposed to feel satisfying. Instead, it felt like surgery, necessary but painful, leaving scars that would never fully heal. His phone buzzed with a call from Northwestern Memorial. "Mr. Mercer, this is Dr. Kim. I wanted to let you know that Marcus Brooks is awake and asking for you." Julian arrived at the hospital to find Marcus sitting up in bed, looking remarkably good for someone who'd been nearly killed 3 days earlier. His head was still bandaged, but his eyes were clear and alert. "The wheelchair guy," Marcus said with a weak grin. "Heard you saved my life. Heard you're going to make a full recovery. Doctors say I'll be back on the court by Christmas." Marcus's expression grew serious. "My sister's been beating herself up about this, blaming herself for what happened." Julian's chest tightened. "Where is she?" "Cafeteria. Getting coffee she doesn't want because she needs an excuse to leave the room when she starts crying. Found her in the hospital's nearly empty cafeteria, sitting alone at a corner table, with an untouched cup of coffee growing cold in her hands. She looked up when he approached, and the pain in her dark eyes nearly broke him. "How is he really?" Julian asked, taking the seat across from her. "Going to live, going to walk, going to play basketball?" Her voice was steady, but tears tracked down her cheeks. "No thanks to me. Danielle, I should have known. Should have realized that walking away wouldn't protect them." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I was naive to think Richard would just let us disappear." Julian reached across the table, covering her hands with his. She didn't pull away, which felt like a small miracle. "This wasn't your fault, wasn't it? I knew the kind of world you lived in, knew the dangers. But I stayed anyway because—" She trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. "Because you loved me," Julian said quietly. "Because I loved you." Past tense. The words hit like physical blows, but Julian absorbed them without flinching. He'd earned this pain. "I understand." Danielle looked up, studying his face with the intensity she'd always brought to difficult moments. "Do you? Because I've spent 3 days trying to figure out how to hate you, and I can't do it. I should hate you for what you did to my father. I should hate you for dragging my family into your war. I should hate you for making me fall in love with someone I can never forgive. But you saved Marcus. You risked everything to stop Richard. You could have run, hidden, protected yourself. Instead, you chose to fight for us." Julian's throat tightened. "It was the least I could do." "No," Danielle said firmly. "It was the most you could do, and that matters." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them like a bridge neither was sure they could cross. "What happens now?" Julian asked finally. Danielle was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she spoke, her voice carried a resolution that both terrified and thrilled him. "Now we figure out if love can coexist with justice, if two broken people can build something whole together, if redemption is possible for someone who's caused as much pain as you have. And if it's not possible," Danielle's smile was sad but genuine, "then at least we'll have tried. At least we'll have fought for something good." Julian felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Hope. "There's somewhere I'd like to take you," he said, "if you're willing." 3 hours later, they stood outside the Harrington Hotel, scene of their first meeting, and so many nights that felt like a lifetime ago. The ballroom had been rented for a private event, a memorial service for the workers who died in various industrial accidents over the past decade. Thomas Brooks' name was on the memorial wall. "I've been funding this organization for 2 years, Julian said quietly. Anonymously. "It's not much, but it's something." Danielle reached out, tracing her father's name with trembling fingers. They stood together in the quiet ballroom, surrounded by the ghosts of Julian's past and the possibility of their future. The space looked different in daylight, smaller, less magical, more human. "Would you dance with me?" Julian asked, just as he had that first night. "You know you can't," Danielle replied, echoing their first conversation. "Then dance for both of us." But this time, instead of taking his hand and swaying alone, Danielle knelt beside his wheelchair. She took his face in her hands and kissed him, a kiss heavy with pain, desperation, and a fragile spark of hope. When they broke apart, tears streamed down both their faces. "This doesn't fix it, Julian," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I know," he said, his own voice breaking. "It can't. But maybe," she continued, her hands still framing his face, "maybe it's a start, a promise to try, to build something good from the wreckage." Julian nodded, his heart full of an emotion he'd never expected to feel. Gratitude, not for his wealth or power, or the empire he'd built and lost and reclaimed. Gratitude for a second chance he'd never dared to hope for. As they left the ballroom together, not as a billionaire and his employee, not as a victim and her father's killer, but as two people choosing love over logic and hope over history, Julian realized something profound. Sometimes the most powerful love stories weren't about perfect people finding each other. Sometimes they were about broken people choosing to heal together. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, a single dance could save two souls. If this story moved you, if it made you believe in second chances and the power of redemption, then you understand why some stories need to be told. Share this with someone who needs hope. Comment below with your thoughts. And remember, the most beautiful endings come from the most impossible beginnings.